All right. Well, according to my screen, I have a mic and a camera, and I'm recording. Is that what you're seeing on your end?
Yes.
All right. In that case, here we go. All right. The cardiovascular system begins with heart anatomy, the standard type of cell, tissue, and organ approach that we've taken all semester. And realizing that the role of the heart is central to our multicellular body. It's central to having organs and organ systems because all living things are made of cells. The basic structure of the human body is cells that are not just functioning and alive, doing a specific job, but are also interdependent on one another, so that the heart takes care of the services of the water that cells arose in. Those services included providing all of the supplies like oxygen, like nutrients, like hydration that are essential for cellular life. It includes removing wastes and keeping the environment of the cell one that is capable of supporting that life. So I want to emphasize from the beginning that the heart has two things that you always have to remember. One is that it's Valentine Day representation. That beautiful symmetrical form isn't anything like the way the heart is constructed. It is asymmetric. There are four chambers, two atria and two ventricles, but it is built around a massive left ventricle. The right ventricle is kind of a mere flap on the side of it. The atria above are filling chambers. Now, the cardiovascular system is what works together to provide this kind of ocean current or pond water environment for every living cell. So the cardiovascular system is going to be the heart. Its related blood vessels, which are shown kind of in rough form here. And then that mobile tissue, the blood, which is going to carry those supplies into the living cell on a constant basis, with oxygen being the most critical need, the thing you die fastest without, followed by things like hydration, followed by nutrition, followed by electrolyte balance, and carrying away those wastes. The blood is going to be that ultimate connective tissue, not structurally connective, not hard material that provides a shape or a size or something that can bear weight, but rather a functionally connective tissue. It's going to unite all of those needs and requirements and deliver them to the cells. So we're going to talk about circulation of materials through the body, just like an ocean water current that's bringing in supplies, bringing in nutrients, carrying away waste. It's the heart that keeps that motion going. And our blood pressure, which fluctuates always on a positive side, 120 to 80 millimeters of mercury of pressure, means that the blood is constantly moving. So what can we say about the geometry, the anatomy of the heart? First of all, it's a double pump. Two circuits which are separate from one another, and basically leaving one side of the heart shoves blood into one circuit and returns it to the other side, which then supplies the other circuit. So we have a right side of the heart, shown here, pumping deoxygenated blood to the lungs, where oxygen is absorbed, but equally important, carbon dioxide is dropped off. Returning to the left side of the heart, which will then pump it out to the, in this drawing, much reduced much reduced systemic circuit. In the case of the left side, the systemic departure from the heart is carrying oxygenated blood for distribution to all the living tissues where oxygen is dropped off and CO2 is picked up. So first thing, right side to the lungs, left side to the heart, to the body, back to the right side in a constant, in my mind, it's kind of is like a figure eight, kind of like it's drawn here. But of course, because the systemic circuit occupies all the tissues we see except the lungs, it's a branching tube system. Arteries are those blood vessels that carry blood away from the heart. And notice that on the systemic circuit, that is oxygenated blood. But on the pulmonary circuit, it's deoxygenated blood. So it's a reversal. That pulmonary circuit is separate from systemic, but it's not oxygenated blood. It's the direction relative to the heart that defines an artery carrying blood away from the heart. After the capillaries, which are the exchange units, that's where materials can leave the blood and where materials can re-enter the blood and be carried back to the heart. Veins are those impermeable tubes that carry blood back toward the heart. They enter and exit the bloodstream by a very simple forced diffusion. You remember diffusion. It is the movement of materials from areas of high concentration to low concentration. It is a water solution. And this is a classic source-sink relationship. By that I mean, you arrive at an area of high concentration with blood that is low concentration, and so diffusion drives material into the blood. Or conversely, you arrive with blood at a low concentration surrounded by tissues that are at a high concentration. So that would move material into the blood. Because we're oxygenating the lungs, we have constant high oxygen in the lung, and we're suffusing the capillaries with that oxygen, and it's being carried away by the flowing blood and replaced by blood that's low in oxygen. So there's a constant diffusion gradient, moving oxygen into the blood and CO2 out of the blood in the lungs. Conversely, in the tissues, we're entering tissues that are consuming oxygen, so the tissues are low in oxygen and the arriving blood is high. So oxygen is moved by diffusion out of the blood into the surrounding tissues where it is absorbed and consumed, keeping it low. So oxygen's always driven out in the capillary beds of the systemic circuit. Likewise, that oxygen is being used for aerobic respiration and generating CO2. So the tissues are always high in CO2. That mixed diffusion drives CO2 into the capillaries and into the blood, and the flowing blood carries it away, replacing it with blood that's low in CO2. So all through the body, diffusion is sufficient to move these gases in and out of the blood. The position of the heart is not central. These four-chambered heart with two atria above and two ventricles below is tilted, meaning that if you take the septum or a midline of the heart, it is tilted relative to the sternum. It is rotated so that from the anterior position, as we see here, you're seeing more of the right side of the heart. And it is actually shifted to the left. And this is such a permanent condition that it has altered the construction of our lungs. So whereas the right lung has 3 lobes, the left lung has only 2, and a cavity for the pericardium in the heart that it contains. So the heart is tilted, it is rotated so that with a right side forward, and it is offset to the left. The transverse section shown here, going right across the top of the heart with some parts removed. You can see that in that upper drawing, we have cut the trachea, those blue and yellow tubes, that are providing the connection, the airway down into the lungs. We've also removed a section of the aorta so that you can see below it. But this is the area above the heart. You can clearly see the left and right lungs surrounding the pericardial cavity, which is part of that space between the lungs. That space is called the mediastinum. And in addition to holding the heart and its pericardium, basically supporting the heart in position but allowing it to freely move at all times, it is also big tube central. The trachea and the bronchi go through this space. The esophagus that you can see in the back goes through this space. And all the big tubes, the aorta and pulmonary arteries, the so-called ejection vessels from the heart, right side and left side, and the arrival vessels, the vena cavas and the pulmonary veins, bringing blood back to the heart. Membranes, as all other organs that we'll study, are surrounded by serous membranes, which is a double wall membrane, an outer or an inner or visceral membrane is tightly adhering to the surface of the heart and separated by a space. From the visceral membrane is separated from the outer membrane, and it is filled with a fluid that allows for movement. Now, when you see this cavity, we've seen this before when we studied joints. There was a synovial cavity with fluid, and what that actually does is it adds hydraulic support to the outer perimeter of the heart, but it also adds lubrication. When you move the heart within that cavity, it doesn't have to rub membrane on membrane. What it does is it basically shifts, rubs that against a fluid covering, greatly reducing the friction. So the visceral layer, as I said, is when the position of that on that right-hand diagram where the fist is shoved into a balloon. You can see the membrane of the balloon that is closest to the fist would be like the visceral layer of the serous pericardium, and the outer layer would be like the visceral layer, an outer layer that is going to interact with surrounding organs, in this case the big tubes and the lungs most prominently. This kind of double wall construction is illustrated by this fist in a balloon idea, but kind of showing you that this is a continuous membrane that can maintain a fluid contents and fluid pressure. The structure of the heart is an outer layer called the epicardium. We're using these prefixes more and more. Epi always means outermost or topmost. The epicardium is a membrane layer that allows for movement. It allows for lubrication and free movement over the surfaces of the surrounding tissues. The middle layer is that dense, heavy muscle with its thickest muscle in the myocardium, the muscular wall of the heart, which is arranged on a fibrous network of support connective tissue, and is densely populated with cardiac muscle cells. Cardiac muscle cells are striated like skeletal cells, but you recall they had a shorter and branched configuration. They also had intercalated discs, special connections that increased the surface area and bound them together more tightly. And why is that necessary? Well, the skeletal muscle, what you're interested in doing is hooking strong fibers together at length, but hooking them to bones across the joint so that you get an articulation, a jointed movement. Whereas what you're building with this muscle is a bag. And hydraulic pressure, whether it's liquid or gas, is always the same. A tiny hole allows the pressure to escape. So this has to be a very dense and strong wall. In addition to holding the fluid, it has to pressurize the fluid and basically that pressure will move the fluid, blood flow in a particular direction. The inner layer, because it's a surface, and here I'm talking about those cells that actually face the inner chamber. So the cells that are coming in contact with the blood as it fills the heart and then is expelled. It is epithelial tissue and called the endocardium. These are surface layers that are continuous with the inner surface layers of the great vessels. So continuous with the layers of the veins, the inner layer of the vein that is delivering blood into the heart chambers as it fills and then contracts to expel the blood. And it is continuous then with the aorta and with the coronary arteries that are there to receive the blood at high pressure and move it away from the heart. Here is a illustration of the heart wall. This is the location right here of the section that has been cut, and you can see these various layers with the parietal pericardium, that outer layer. And as you notice, connective tissue, areolar tissue, a general connective tissue, loose connective tissue, providing some substance for the attachment of the outer, and then this mesothelium that lines the pericardial cavity. Notice them flat with tight junctions between the cells, providing that space. This part is constantly moving by the contraction of the muscles, and so up and down, but this fluid-filled space allows it to move freely with a minimum of resistance. Here is the myocardium, starting here with areolar tissue on the outside and on the inside, providing that. Now think of this as sort of like primer for paint. Here's the substance of the heart wall, the motivating tissue, covered with areolar tissue that provides a platform that anchors the outer surface of the myocardium in a way that you can then attach the mesothelium, the epithelial tissue, to provide this space. Likewise here, this areolar tissue anchors blood vessels as it penetrates into the wall of the heart and provides a platform for this endocardium that we find, that inner layer inside the chamber of the heart where the blood is flowing. As we saw before last semester, every organ has all four tissue types, and we have named connective and muscular and epithelial here. Nervous is not illustrated in this diagram, but there are specialized sensitive cells sending nerve impulses. So nervous tissue is represented here. Now, this section is excellent, and the drawing in the upper right is excellent, showing you that the heart is mostly left ventricle. This massive wall over here is the side of the heart that propels blood left side to the body, to the systemic circuit. Because the systemic circuit is so extensive and involves so much friction, it must be pushed by a lot more muscle cells. Here's the right side of the heart. Notice this kind of irregular formation, this kind of almost perforated muscle tissue and a very, very thin outer covering. The right side actually pumps the same volume of blood as the left side, but because it's only going through the pulmonary arteries, through the lungs, and back through the pulmonary vein, all on the same level of the heart, it requires much less pumping pressure. Up above these ventricles, these muscular walls are going to be topped by receiving chambers called atria. They do have a slight pumping need, but most of the filling of the heart is going to be passing based on blood pressure from the ventricle pumping. The atria's contraction is only to top off the blood load in the ventricle. But I'll always want you to remember that asymmetry, notice the size of the chambers are comparable, but the outer muscular covering relaxed. This is what it looks like when it's filled with blood, and those muscle cells are sliding and are expanding based on heart pressure, blood pressure. And this is what it looks like when they contract. The external anatomy in the position shown from the anterior side, you can see that most of the exposure in this drawing is the right side of the heart. That's part of that rotation, with the right atria above. In fact, when it's not filled, it collapses and has the appearance of an ear. So it's why it's called, this outer flap is called the auricle, which covers the right atrium, the receiving chamber for the right ventricle. And then the exit point from the right ventricle is this pulmonary trunk and the pulmonary artery, shown there, drawn in blue because they're carrying the oxygenated blood. This sulcus and the blood vessels that occupy it are separating the right side of the heart from the left side and are running along the junction of the septum, the interventricular septum inside. You can basically see only a little corner of the left atrium and the left ventricle below, and the construction of the heart makes this manifold between the ventricles and atria very strong, the strongest part of the heart, because this is where valves must open and close in order to successfully direct the blood flow in one direction only. And to do that, you have to have a surrounding tissue that's very strong so the valves can seat to them. But the exit from this left side is running under this pulmonary base here, and you can see it exiting here with the aortic arch and the first major arteries coming off of the aorta at top. So these three are supplying the head, shoulders, and arms with blood flow, whereas if you turn this corner and go down the descending aorta, the major arteries then departing are supplying the lower thorax, the abdomen, and flowing then to the pelvis and limbs. Over here, the final vessels we have not identified are these two vessels. These are drawn red, showing oxygenated blood returning from the lung. These are the pulmonary veins. This is a real heart with the fat removed, and you can see the massive right ventricle and the entrance into the pulmonary trunk. Here is the right atrium and its outer auricle, and the way these vessels are braided together is indicative of the connections and connective tissue that forms between them. If you've ever watched a hydraulic system with hoses, especially fire hoses when they turn on the water, and you have to have a hold of that end, that brass nozzle when a fire hose is turned on, or the water pressure will cause it to flap around. And the same thing is happening here. You're not only pumping blood out, but you're asking it to change direction based on the shape of the vessel. So this is a moving organ that's producing a pulse in these vessels. And so they're almost braided together to support one another and to absorb that expansion and contraction and the force that it generates. You can see here the sulcus, the little indentation that provides a place where blood vessels can descend the heart wall, in this case bringing oxygenated blood down and penetrating into capillaries throughout the heart muscle, and then returning through veins back up to a perimeter vein that runs around this junction between the atria and the ventricles. This is the cardiac circulation, which is something we'll deal with in just a moment. So entering and leaving the right side of the heart, you enter through the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, and blood enters this right atrium. It then descends into the the right atrium descends into the right ventricle during filling. The right atrium contracts to top off the right ventricle, and the ventricle contracts. The exit is through the pulmonary trunk, which quickly splits the blood flow right and left, going to the left lung. And back here you can see the exit vessels for the right lung. Entering and leaving the left side of the heart, you are entering the left side of the heart with the returned oxygenated blood from the lungs. The left and right pulmonary veins are shown. You can't see them that well from the anterior side, but from the back they're very apparent, leading to this left atrium. You can see the flap, the auricle that forms it. It descends into the left ventricle, which you can only see a small rim from the anterior side. But when the left ventricle contracts, it pushes blood sort of in this direction, but underneath the right side into this ascending aortic arch, and then behind the heart, the descending aorta. Internal heart anatomy is shown by this section. Oxygen poor blood entering through this double port system in the right atrium, going through the right atrioventricular valve into the right ventricle, exiting the right pulmonary valve, semilunar valve, called the pulmonary valve because it is going to the lungs. Shown in purple here as an indication of its difference from the systemic circuit. Once out here and in the lungs, it's oxygenated, brought back by the pulmonary veins and entering this left atrium. Notice there are no valves here in the atria. This is low enough pressure that the contraction squeezes these into slits that are sufficient to propel the blood downward and basically add that final bit of blood to the ventricular load. About 20% of the blood, just topping off that ventricular load prior to contraction of the ventricle. Down through the left atrioventricular valve to the left ventricle. And again, I hate this drawing. This is much too symmetrical. This septum and this left wall should be much thicker in comparison to this rather flimsy flap, which is the right ventricular wall. But when this left ventricle contracts, it pressurizes the blood until this valve opens and expels the blood, the so-called ejection vessel on the left side, to the aorta. The valves, these atrioventricular valves, are so named because they are between the atrium and ventricle. The semilunar valves are named for their shape. But on the right side, the atrioventricular valve is also called the tricuspid because of its three flaps. The pulmonary valve is called, the semilunar valve on the right side is called the pulmonary valve because it's directing blood to the lungs. On the left side, the atrioventricular valve is called the mitral valve or the bicuspid because it has two lobes, and it exits through this left semilunar or the aortic valve because of its directing the blood to the systemic circuit. And there are those names: bicuspid or mitral for the atrioventricular valve and aortic for the semilunar valve. Now, this drawing really contains much more information. It may not be that apparent from the beginning, but what we have done is cut the atria connections away, showing you the thickened muscle, the way the muscle is braided around this white Y-shaped body of connective tissue. The valves are made of very tough, flexible material. And because it's a cellular structure, all living things are made of cells, this can be grown and renewed through life. We do have late life valve problems in many hearts, but in fact, in general, this is a very robust structure. Notice these larger intake valves in the open position. So what this is showing on the left side are atrioventricular valves, which are filling the heart. You can see they're opening. Blood that's flowing in on the right side and left side are dropping through these valves and basically flowing the upper atria and the lower ventricles together. At this time, the semilunar valves that you see here, the base of the Y, are tightly closed, and they're closed by the blood pressure that is in the exit vessel above. So when you close the semilunar valve, it preserves that pressure in the pulmonary artery or in the aorta. By pushing on the back of the valve, you can see this closed aortic valve here as we're filling the heart on this left side. When the ventricles contract, it pushes against the back of these valves, the atrioventricular valves, and basically billows them up and closes the pathway to the atrium. When the pressure of the blood in the ventricle reaches a certain point, and that point is defined by the pressure in the exit vessel above. So if the aorta has gone from 122 maximum, the systemic pressure at rest, and has gone back down through 115, 110, 100, 90 to 80, when this 80 millimeters above is matched and exceeded by the contraction below, then that pushes through the aortic valve. See how it kind of unfolds? Look at the complete collar that is formed by the tube-like atrioventricular valve when it's opened, whereas it folds into this kind of three-part strong valve, reinforcing against the greatest pressure in the body. So the semilunar valves are open here for ejection. This manifold is anchored and supported by the greatest concentration of connective tissue, and also by the way the muscular tissue is continuous with it. This is a myogram of the heart that has been color enhanced to indicate the diffusion of the branching tubes, the arteries and veins that are supplying the living cells of the heart itself. The systemic circuit pumps to the rest of the body. The pulmonary circuit pumps to the lungs, but is this system of coronary arteries and cardiac veins that you can see pump blood down to the very thick ventricle walls. Look at the size of these arteries going down from this ventricular cap where the valves are, and basically providing a much more dense array of branching tubes to supply oxygen to this constantly moving tissue. Now, another distinction for the heart: our skeletal muscles move when we command them to perform a certain movement. They do not respond when we basically don't send nerve messages to the neuromuscular junction. They basically rest. This muscle never does that. It has a slight pause to fill, but during that time it's moving as you expand the heart walls outward, and it is preparing for the next timed contraction. From the time your heart commences full-time beating as you're separated from the mother till the time that you die. Now you'll notice here some arteries that are supplying blood to the atria, but they are small and thin, and the reason for that is, of course, there's so many fewer cells up here to maintain. So this coronary circulation is going to take advantage of a circular artery and vein network that runs around in this junction. By the way, we have now shifted to a new view, the posterior view. And look how different it looks. Here is the aorta and the superior vena cava that we saw so prominently from the other side. Below the aorta, notice the close association and connection with the pulmonary arteries. Notice the return right below of the pulmonary vein. So this is the left atrium right here. And notice how centrally they penetrate into that left atrium. Here's the right atrium. Here is the inferior vena cava going to the right side, and you can notice a much larger expanse of left atrium down here and a smaller exposure of the right atrium. Notice that the blood supplying the cardiac circuit is basically coming out of the left ventricle right on the other side, right above the semilunar valve, and circulating through this circuit of arteries to circle the heart. So this oxygenated blood at every septum, at every division, basically descends the heart wall, as we saw in this actual X-ray, and divides into smaller arterioles and capillary beds to supply all of these tissues. The deoxygenated blood after the capillary beds returning to these veins and flowing in a circular manner around to the back of the right atrium. So this part is called the coronary sinus, an enlargement which collects the deoxygenated blood and holds it. When the heart relaxes and the right atrium has no pressure on the blood, it then flows back into the right atrium and returns to the propulsion that the heart provides. So it's going to go into the right atrium. After going through the heart, it's going into the right atrium, right ventricle, and then straight to the lungs for oxygen supply. Internal heart anatomy is also amplified by, here's that coronary sinus where the cardiac blood returns to the general circulation. Here are the openings for the superior and inferior vena cava. The exit for the cardiac circulation is up here in the aorta, right above the semilunar valve, so where the pumping pressure of the heart is highest. So the heart takes a priority, since it's pumping the blood, it takes a priority on blood supply. Now the brain is located further away, but there are regulatory mechanisms to ensure that after the heart, the brain receives a constant flow of blood. We see a couple of other features. These atrioventricular valves are much less robust than the semilunar valves, but they would basically, when you contract this right ventricle, they basically would just push those flaps together and push them straight through and allow blood to go back to the atrium. So we see these papillary muscles and these connections, the chordae tendineae, connective tissue connected to heart muscle on the inner wall. So it's sort of like little Mario plumbers with ropes. As these close, these muscles tighten and do not allow the atrioventricular valves to reverse under the great ventricular pumping pressure. Here are the so-called heart strings, and we all know that when it comes to popular media, poetry, music, song lyrics, there is no organ that surpasses the heart. It is endowed with a whole bunch of emotional and personality traits, and those heartstrings are basically a pumping and pressure function. So when we see the heart pumping, here is the filling cycle. This muscle is relaxed, and so blood pressure flowing in from above, this is showing the left side. That blood pressure was created by the pumping of this ventricle on the systemic side. So when this is ejecting, it goes up to 120 millimeters in the aorta, and as soon as this begins to relax, the blood tries to back up. That slams this valve closed. And this then is a relaxed chamber capable of expansion, and it is the returning blood pressure here that is basically filling the ventricle and atrium together. When the ventricle begins contracting, you see here the contraction has closed this atrioventricular valve to allow the relaxing atrium to begin filling above, while the blood is pressurized below. And after a period of time, because it starts at low pressure, this is at low pressure when you're filling, has to go all the way up to that diastolic pressure to push this door open. And this is showing the ejection stage. So that's basics of heart view. And what I'm going to do now is to come back to my recording and stop it. So this recording